So excited today to be speaking with Carole, who, as Hudson said, is former Director of Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation at the National Security Council. She was on loan from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I know we have to say all the acronyms here. So FinCEN.
We do love our acronyms in government. So
However, she is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an executive in residence at a unnamed venture capital firm focusing on national security technology. Maybe she can tell us a little bit more about that later. To get started, when you were at NSC, you were thinking about identity in terms of national security, in terms of cybersecurity. What were, the big digital identity problems you were trying to solve there?
Yeah, and I love that framing, especially in the context of Web3. So thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Because when I was at the NSC, I had three really key issues that I was focusing on, trying to help drive coordination for the U.S. counter-ransomware campaign, because cyber criminals continue to pwn Americans, and it's both a financial and cybercrime issue. So a really key nexus for my background from hard cyber and financial regulator. Also working on cryptocurrency and the executive order on digital assets that the president issued, and then on our work on digital identity. And you can't really work on any of those things without working on the others. Like the core issues around cybercrime is often targeting and compromising identity because they're trying to steal credentials that will be used or sold for future conduct of financial crime, or they're leveraging weaknesses in identity management solutions in order to conduct those unauthorized intrusions. And then for cryptocurrency, the reason why it is the favored tool to be laundered by cyber criminals is because of one of the core weaknesses, I think, that's existed in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, was that these things were built without accounting for certain features of things like identity, and especially in value transfer systems, identity is a critical component to any effective anti-money laundering framework. So really all these things tie in together very much: cybercrime, cryptocurrency, and identity. So that was a really key focus for all of us, and was very excited to work on a lot of things related to identity solutions, including being a part of the great team that's working on the identity executive order that the White House announced in March, that's trying to really focus on measures that the U.S. government can take to combat identity theft and fraud in federal benefits programs.
And we will talk a little bit more about that executive order later. Talking about know your customer laws and how that fits into all of this, what were kind of the lessons you learned in traveling around, talking to the private sector, working within, intra-agency, and how could that apply to the rest of these Web3 challenges?
That's a great question, because I'll first say that I give a lot of credit to the space and the fact that I feel that the conversation and just the players and stakeholders in the ecosystem have evolved a lot in many years. Several years ago, I would be at forums with members of the crypto industry telling me, like, it's impossible to regulate this sector, everything's decentralized, it's impossible to know who's on the other side of the internet. And of course, that was something that, regulators and people with cyber backgrounds and tech backgrounds who know there have been technologies that have existed for years that allow for establishing trust and identity on the other side of the internet. They just weren't built into and accounted for in these systems prior to launch. So it was interesting to see that those were a lot of the faces and the voices that we were hearing in the crypto space years ago. But now we have, entities like the Web3 ID Forum that are specifically recognizing the benefits that identity can bring by leveraging this technology, and also help solve some of the problems that this technology is creating. So I wanted to openly acknowledge that I think there's been a really great evolution and maturing in the conversation and the focus on the kinds of innovative technologies that can solve these issues. I think especially for KYC, oftentimes there's a discussion about KYC needs to evolve. I think a key lesson that I hope that industry can bring to the conversations in the future, what I would recommend, is more specificity about what that means. Identity means a lot in different contexts. It can mean my gamer tag and my terrible accuracy score, on Call of Duty or Halo, but it can also be like my KYC obligations for going to a regulator regulated financial institution, but different financial institutions have different obligations. Banks are bound by much more rigorous and rules-based obligations for collecting certain data and then conducting verification of that specific rules-based information like name, address, identifier, et cetera. Most crypto exchanges are actually just bound by risk-based approaches for their KYC obligations. And it's because KYC is kind of a colloquial term that really means a lot of different things. Knowing your customer upfront, so trying to understand like what is the identity of this person, verifying that the identity is real and belongs to this human, then monitoring the risk profile of that person, and doing things like looking for authentication to get account access to prevent things like fraud. So KYC is a broad term, and I would see conversations where people would make comments about what needs to evolve, but then not really be able to engage in a deep discussion on like, well, if your regulatory requirements are risk-based, is this actually a regulatory problem? Is it an enforcement problem? Is it an implementation problem, like talking with your lawyers because they're taking an overly conservative approach? FinCEN has said since 2004 that digital certificates were totally acceptable to use for KYC purposes. So I think that there's a lot of interest in innovation, and I've appreciated that. I feel that FinCEN was leaning very far forward through innovation hours and like the tech sprint that they just did with FDIC to embrace these technologies and look at them. But I think sometimes the conversations with industry don't get into the nitty-gritty, so that even when I was there, I couldn't figure out like what actually could I change in the regulation. Like I was here for it, and I think that they still are. The regulators are interested in that. So I think for a lesson, having some specificity about what part of the identity ecosystem and the identity requirements are really the things that are causing barriers, and let's talk about what the policy changes are that can help address that.
Following up on that in terms of where Web3 might play a role in these different processes, do you already have some insights into what that might be? Are there things that the industry should be thinking about in terms of collaborating with government? Like what exactly should Web3 be doing for the government? And is it really that different than Web2 and what that could provide?
Oh, and a great, very loaded question. Fantastic. And I love, what can Web3 do for the government? What can the government do for Web3? Great question. Exactly. So I know, obviously, coming as the big bad, mean former regulator, I obviously have a stance on like what the role of identity is going to be in the future of this ecosystem. And I think many DeFi, more DeFi pure visionaries. We've certainly had some interesting debates on in some fascinating forums, but I really appreciate that dialogue first is just critical. But something that I think that the Web3 community, what I hope will help them understand and at least be sympathetic to what the regulators and the national security experts see. Rails that had traditionally been bifurcated. So this actually builds a little bit on what our keynote just talked about. Rails that supported information transfer, data transfer over the internet. Like identity, there are technologies that can enable identity and trust on the other side of the internet. That's good. We like that optionality, but it's not a critical component. Like we get kind of itchy at the idea of identity being built into all of your internet traffic and everything that you're doing for data transfer. Value transfer, so like Fedwire, chips, Swift, knowing that Swift is actually information transfer, but it's about value transfer. We love identity. We love identity and value transfer. It's a huge part of anti-money laundering requirements. It's the way that we are able to investigate fraud and make sure that there is recourse for consumers that are defrauded to try to go get their funds back. And now, on the same rails in Web3 and distributed ledger technologies, you can be conducting on the same rails value transfer and data transfer, and with the current obfuscating and encrypting mechanisms that are being built out, with the right encryption, you can't even tell which is occurring. Is it a data transfer or is it a value transfer? Now, for extreme privacy advocates, I think that to them is a big win. From a regulatory perspective, that's a really tough issue. Now, technologies, we think, could potentially solve this problem if you solve the technologies and the governance issues, and the market ultimately comes up with what the designs and frameworks should be, including things like verifiable credentials that can help address these issues. But I wanted to mention that to try to help the developers and geniuses that are in this room and that will help to solve this problem, since I'm just highlighting that it's a problem, not solving it like the rest of you will. But I think that core issue is really going to be critical to try to get Web3 right, and to make sure that we get the calibration of privacy right, especially in value transfer systems, because I don't believe that the future of DeFi, if it really is very decentralized, and I am skeptical of that because I think that a lot of people really do like intermediaries for a lot of different reasons. Like, I don't keep all of my cash underneath my mattress, but who am I to tell other people not to do that and keep their assets in an unhosted wallet? I am sympathetic to people that want to do that. And I understand why, because of the failures that we see with centralized institutions. So there's going to be an interesting future of what the roles of intermediaries play. And then with privacy, the implication of privacy is not anonymity. There is data there that must be able to be disclosable and discoverable under certain protections, permissions. So I think that figuring out how to get that right is really going to be critical to navigate the future of Web3 and identity.
I'm really glad you brought up privacy. I know you and I have talked about this a little bit, but are there existing government frameworks for privacy that the Web3 community should be turning to or looking at and developing products?
I love pointing to that, since some of my favorite people in government wrote the NIST privacy framework. So I think that NIST has both identity guidance and the 863.3 series. The NIST privacy framework is also fantastic and points out the principles and a structure and a framework that can be really critical to the future of Web3 development. Thinking about that and thinking about it through the entire stack of the technology and the governance of Web3 systems. So whether it's at the market level or the network layer or the protocol layer or the application layer or the user, there's different privacy considerations that you want to have at each level. And if you use frameworks like the NIST privacy framework, I think that could be very helpful. One thing that I also like to try to highlight to people that focus on identity is that I think that a lot of the issues around identity in Web3 and decentralized systems actually just point back to some of the core problems with identity in the traditional space, like issues around there not being access to things like authoritative attribute verification services, and there not being very readily available strong credentials provided from government institutions that are very useful in things like know your customer, meeting know your customer requirements. So I think that if they look at some of the really mature thinking, and you've got some brilliant people that were leading that work at the White House, and even from industry that will be speaking later, and then of course Congressman Bill Foster is just also a visionary. So I think that I would encourage really listening to their insights. They have the battle scars and have been battle tested on the front lines of identity policy, and know where a lot of the key obstacles have been. And I think that if you solve those core identity and privacy issues, those things can then be leveraged to support Web3 solutions.
Carole, you've spent a lot of time at conferences like this where the public and private sector are coming together. In your experience, where does communication tend to break down, and how do we get past that?
And especially in Web3, there's a lot of interesting communications certainly that happen on both sides. So I'll say that I think when I was at FinCEN and at the White House, sometimes I would see communications break down when there would be a lack of sympathy and a lack of specificity on both sides, whether it was either the government or the regulators not coming in speaking to exactly what we see as the core issues, and to help them understand, no, I actually feel that we've been very clear about this regulatory framework. Here's all of my guidance that points out why I think that you are something. I think that kind of specificity, transparency, and open engagement is so critical. But I also feel that when industry comes in and gives sometimes some of the same talking points, saying things like, oh, KYC is messed up, and I'm like, okay, what's messed up about it? Let's have that conversation. Here for it. Let's talk about what specifically the policy changes are, the operational changes, how can we do it? So I think that sometimes when there would be a lack of specificity, that's where things would break down. But then that absence of empathy at times, I know obviously in the Web3 space, there's a lot of people that are at a very different place on the calibration of regulation. To a point, some people feel like regulation should be 0 on this bell curve, right? But I feel that there is an apex, right? To a point, regulation is a good thing. It drives consumer trust. Safety and soundness regimes and cybersecurity. We're seeing APTs in North Korea pwn these guys for $500 million in one hack. Nobody wants that. No one in this ecosystem does, and certainly not national security experts. So we like, we see that regulation brings a good thing. There just is an apex where then where regulation can be overly burdensome. It can bring too much exposure of private information, or it could like reduce human rights and human dignity to the point where we're at a police state, which is not something that Americans want, nor that regulators want. It's really that conversation about where is that apex that actually needs to be had. So that kind of empathy about like understanding that the future is not going to be one without regulation, trying to understand where the regulators are coming from and coming to the table, and then also important for regulators, I think, to bring the same kind of empathy to an industry where most of them are not trying to defraud Americans. They're not trying to create systems that are exploited easily for money laundering or for cyber criminals. How can we try to drive and incentivize the evolutions that we need in the market?
I know this will come up later in our private sector panel, but interoperability is a big issue moving towards Web3 and making sure, especially within the government, that data can be shared and this all works out. How do you, as a former regulator and former government official working on this, think about interoperability?
A great question, and also something that I think distributed ledger technologies can help a lot. That's like part of why I think that there's some really interesting, innovative use cases that I see with DLT. So I think interoperability is critical for something to, especially if the future really is this decentralized system. You've got to have verifiable credentials and systems of like trusted issuers of these credentials that are obviously interoperability is key to all of that, as well as just a trust framework that will actually be used and accepted. So I think that that's going to be critical for identity solutions. I know that I definitely saw that the administration cared a lot about interoperability and trying to make sure that through things like the competitiveness executive order that the White House issued, really wanting to make sure that the future of financial markets and tech platforms allows for small businesses to be successful and not just like the biggest institutions to be able to succeed. So I think looking for how standards can help drive that, looking for how other incentive mechanisms inside of government can ensure that that is in fact the future of it. It's certainly a priority.
Mm-hmm. At some point, the Biden administration is expected to release an identity executive order. What do you think are the key components it should have?
I of course love the idea of an identity executive order. So very excited when the White House announced it in March as a part of it was a part of a fact sheet of all the different measures that the government was putting in place to address the significant amount of fraud that occurred in the pandemic. So things like designating a special prosecutor to go after these criminals that were guilty of just like severe abuse and targeting of like the most vulnerable populations to steal and defraud like taxpayers of their benefits. I think that testimony said over $100 billion in the pandemic went straight to criminals in fraudulent payments. So that's not encouraging. So very excited when the White House announced a series of measures, including this executive order that's supposed to focus on the right measures to counter fraud and identity theft in benefits programs, while also directly trying to address issues like equitable outcomes and bias minimization. So I do think that executive order will have to really address some of the core things that the government can do in order to combat that fraud, but it will have to navigate some of they're not incompatible, but the tensions that can exist between security and things like equity and bias minimization, like some of the challenges that come up with solutions around like facial recognition, for example. It's not that it's not an evil technology, but a lot of solutions had been built in a way where bias was an extreme issue. It's important to make sure that we can measure that we can understand how to drive, again, the evolution and the development and use of those technologies to outcomes that we find like much more equitable and acceptable to us. So I think the right measures are looking for what can the government do to help do things like provide attribute validation services to drive and incentivize the development and issuance of strong credentials like mobile driver's licenses, and then also figuring out what are the right measures to put in place for federal benefits programs to make sure that any credentials that are accepted and those identity systems for verification and providing access to those benefits are measuring and accounting for equity impacts for things like remote verification and what those challenges can be in achieving IAL2, like a higher level of identity assurance levels. consistent with the current NIST guidance under the 863.3 guidance that's out right now. So I think that some measures on standards, on standards work, on what the different benefits programs can do, should be accepting as as solutions that both help to combat this fraud, but also try to protect and defend those equitable outcomes and drive bias minimization.
I know we had some veiled references earlier to the collapse of FTX. I'm going to put you on the spot here. We can debate the extent to which this is going to have an effect on cryptocurrency policy and regulation. Do you think it will have an impact on the government's kind of broader approach to Web3 or create any sort of hesitation?
I definitely think that the government certainly didn't not notice what happened with FTX. And in fact, that was a nice double negative to say. No, they totally noticed, and the Secretary of the Treasury talked about it several times. Basically, I appreciate that they've highlighted that so far they don't see any systemic financial stability impact because of this one system going down, largely because of the lack of direct interaction between crypto with the banking sector and just broader implications for the financial system. So at least that's good. It's not good that so many people were hurt by what happened, of course. So ultimately, I think that this will just reinforce a major focus on that's already existed inside of the executive branch, and also with legislators to look for what is needed specifically on the prudential and safety and soundness regimes, because these companies are already very regulated from an anti-money laundering perspective. Regulated and compliant are different stories, but they're at least regulated. So the policy wonk will say they're super regulated. So I think that you'll see, I think what you're going to see is definitely a surge and focus on enforcement of already long existing obligations, and then really a deliberate focus on what is the right regulatory framework, and then potentially legislative authorities that might be needed to impose that regulatory framework, depending on which approach they decide to go with, to make sure that requirements like dealing with capital reserve and liquidity and commingling of funds and all those protections that sort of were not present in this case, or at least seemingly, reportedly. I will totally defer to regulators to determine what occurred here, but I think it's being spoken about very publicly. So I just think that it will validate in the minds of many regulators that, of course, regulation is needed. I do think that more policy is certainly helpful and needed. I would also just take more enforcement of existing obligations, which I know many people in the Web3 space have feelings about, but I definitely think that enforcement is critical.
I'm going to turn over to questions in a second, but Carole, what do you want the Web3 and digital identity community to walk away with today in terms of big takeaways?
Great. I think big takeaways is a lot of the problems, the underscoring problems behind identity there's a lot of commonality with the traditional identity folks. So I think engaging with those people, whether it's the law enforcement community that will highlight fraud is tech neutral, it happens everywhere. Whether it's engaging with the risk and identity services that have been in this room that have been doing things like verifiable credentials, and solving problems like authentication to the point where now policy for the most part really just needs to be addressed on verification. I think so first, just highlight that you have natural allies and partners in the traditional identity space. Look to them for their wisdom and their perspectives, and then figure out how you can adapt that into your ecosystem. And then the other thing about, I would just say that a future that is decentralized, that really does not have intermediaries. Recognizing that yes, I may rely upon intermediaries, but I recognize maybe I'm not their market, and other people. There's a lot of great benefits that come from decentralized systems. I do not believe that future involves no identity, and appreciate that forums like this recognize that identity will be a critical part of that. You're going to have to directly address and confront that a decentralized system is not going to mean no regulation. So what is the right kind of information that should be visible and disclosable and discoverable to whom? Where does consent exist, and where should consent not have to play a role in discoverability of information in a decentralized system when it's value transfer, when it's financial? I think you're going to have to think about all of that, and ultimately would just encourage an aggressive and proactive approach, because if the sector mitigates that risk in that that future decentralized system, right? Like if you proactively address it through self-regulation or through standards and actual implementation, that is the greatest way to try to prevent an overcorrection by the centralized regulators. So I would just encourage the sector to embrace this technology. Conversations around things like in this forum, I think will be the greatest way to achieve what the outcomes are that you ultimately are trying to drive.
Can we open it to questions? If anyone has questions? Oh, no questions. Oh, one.
No one wants to ask the person who just said enforcement, super important in Web3.
So one of the biggest challenges for Web3 is adoption, right? If you hear people talk about like what's going to stop it from taking off, people won't self-custody their assets or anything like that. Given the fact that the government has to deal with basically all comers from all different levels of tech and socioeconomic backgrounds, how does something like a decentralized identification work in a system like that?
Yeah. Sorry, in a system where adoption is difficult, or how can it maybe incentivize or drive adoption?
Right, where adoption is very difficult and folks who might not be online or are used to dealing with things like the post office, going to do something in person rather than doing it online. And then the leap here for like a decentralized identification seems like a large leap for a lot of folks who interact with things like Social Security or unemployment.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair, and I know that that's been an issue in the DeFi space. Like most people are using centralized entities in some way for that activity. But I think that ultimately the things that will drive greater adoption in a decentralized community are things like trust, and so seeing what the frameworks are that get built out, both on the technology and solution side, but then also for like established frameworks of trusted, issuers of these credentials, and then driving vendor acceptance of these credentials and of these assets in exchange for goods and services are really the things that are going to make other people more comfortable in being able to use these assets. It's tough because DLT supports just a token that could represent literally anything. So it's like all commerce. Like it could be financial, it could be pictures of gorillas, and that's the whole thing. It could be a distributed VPN service. Like there's really, really interesting, fantastic innovations that I'm excited about. I think you're right that there's a bit of tech literacy that has to be driven. So, but I also believe that the market will solve this problem, kind of like how the market has largely like solved authentication. Like authentication is quite easy because technologists have made it very convenient for users to do. The issues around verification go back to that, like you need the access to the authoritative credentials, and who owns most of your authoritative identifiers? The government. So there's opportunities to look for partnerships there. But I think in a system where there isn't a lot of adoption, actually driving the developments in decentralized identity and Web3 ID could actually help solve and address some of those issues around adoption, when people now could have a credential that could then be used or accepted, whether it's in accessing their VA benefits, or going to Social Security Administration or CMS, or if it's going to use their tokens for accessing financial services out in the private sector. So I think that the government enabling and incentivizing those developments, whether it's through the research and development agenda that that the National Science Foundation is now drafting for distributed ledger technologies as a result of the executive order on digital assets, or if it's through like other grants like small business innovation and research. I think there's ways the government can try to incentivize and drive the right innovations that have to happen in the space. And then also as they think about what they could be doing to provide these validation services, that they don't only provide them to centralized issuers, that they provide them to anyone that's developing these solutions in a way so that there's not preference that's being shown. So understanding that there would be, I'm sure, certain standards and expectations for who they provide those services to. So I don't know if that answers your question. Probably not. I know I'm not going to solve the adoption problem for DeFi, but I'm sure you guys will.
Got one over here. I have a question. We've got one here first, and then over.
Oh, sure.
Quick question. On top of that, you mentioned about government stepping in to help the incentive and adoption of standards. From a decentralized, there are complexities, but from a decentralized identity standpoint, the verifiable credential from the W3C is gaining a lot of traction. What would be the path for the government to move from, I don't want to say non-supportive, but what would be the path for them to issue government IDs in a verifiable credential format?
Yeah, I mean, I think that either as like a direct mandate or as a step to examine and look at it. Could be something that comes out of either this executive order or out of other guidance from parts of the White House, like OMB. So the way that the government could potentially drive that is through their own determination that they need to now issue those credentials. They could also just establish that credentials that are consistent with the W3C standards, as long as they meet everything that they want in a credential, would be accepted. So that it's not that it must be used; it's that it can be used when you go in to try to like, for example, onboard at the VA. So I was in the Army, so like when you go to the VA and try to like onboard, that you could use such a credential. So I think there's different ways to incentivize it for them. They could decide to issue those credentials. I think there's a lot right now that needs to be done, because there really aren't like a lot of or any digital federal credentials that we currently issue. There is work that's being done to look at that. Certainly TSA is looking at how to partner with states on the mobile driver's license rollout and acceptance for that through TSA checkpoints. State is looking at e-passports, et cetera. So I think there's opportunities for agencies to look at what they should be doing just generally to first issue any form of a digital credential. But I think that conversations and partnerships to make sure that looking at not just ISO standards, but also W3C standards, and making sure that they meet what the expectations should be around things like privacy, like security, because not knowing I haven't really examined the W3C standards in depth, so I don't know if it addresses all the issues that the ISO standards really have been, but if they do, then I think that's something the government should really be accounting for.
So you mentioned authentication as a solved problem, and that's true, because,
Largely.
Yeah, largely, and it would take few years, right, with adoption of MFA passwordless. But that was a problem when no business models were linked, right, because it was a problem to solve the cyber criminals, stop the bad actors. But when you look at identity, right, your companies' entire business models built around identity, whether it be the big identity platforms, providers, there's so much money on the identity side, right? And moving that from identity providers or aggregators down to consumers, it's a huge business model disruption. So from a policy standpoint, how do you see that evolving on how we transcend from the traditional concentrated identity to decentralized?
Ultimately, I think, just driving standards so that then, I think that even with decentralized identity solutions, that you'll be able to see a lot of arising new businesses. So I think that first, trying to not have things so centralized is probably a bit of an outcome that's consistent with what the administration has really been driving. But I also think that I think that current competitors, they offer a lot of really great services, and their information will still be relevant to do things like provide monitoring of the risk profile of a person. Sometimes I've at least seen conversations think that, well, if I just have the credential and then I get that upfront information, I've met my KYC obligations, or I've screened against the SDN list at first. That's a sanctions compliance program, and it's not. That risk-based approach really requires that broader monitoring, whether it's through some of the tools that we'll be speaking later on some of the industry panels. So I guess I think that there will still be a very diverse identity ecosystem, because it means so much. It's not just these credentials up front. So I think the industry panel will probably have have greater wisdom to offer on what the future of that marketplace and ecosystem looks like. But I do think that greater diversity and competition in identity providers is a good thing for us, and I think that will hold true in Web3.
One more.
We have time for one more. Anyone? Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carole.